It was almost 11 at night when David finally left his office. The district attorney's building was nearly empty, just a few security guards making their rounds. David rubbed his tired eyes as he walked to his car in the parking garage. He'd been working on a major fraud case for the past 12 hours straight, reviewing documents and preparing for tomorrow's hearing. The streets were quiet as he drove through the city. David was careful, staying in his lane, keeping to the speed limit. After 15 years as a prosecutor, he knew the law inside and out. He'd put away dozens of criminals, fought for justice in courtrooms, and earned respect from judges and colleagues alike. Tonight, he just wanted to get home to his wife and kids. That's when he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. David's heart sank a little, but he wasn't worried. He signaled, slowed down, and pulled over to the side of the road. He'd done nothing wrong. Maybe his taillight was out, or perhaps the officer would just give him a warning about something minor. He turned off the engine, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. The officer approached slowly, shining a flashlight directly into David's face. The bright light made it hard to see, but David could make out a tall figure in uniform. The officer's badge read Chambers, and his face wore an expression that made David immediately uncomfortable. There was something cold in those eyes, something that didn't feel right. "License and registration," the officer said. His tone wasn't professional or neutral. It was sharp, almost angry. "Good evening, officer," David said calmly. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" "I said license and registration now." The officer's hand moved closer to his belt. David took a slow breath. He'd been through situations like this before, though not often. "Of course. I'm going to reach for my wallet in my jacket pocket. I'm also an assistant district attorney. My credentials are with my license." The officer's expression changed, but not in the way David expected. Instead of relaxing, the man seemed to tense up even more. "I don't care who you say you are. Give me your documents." Something in the officer's voice set off alarm bells in David's mind. This wasn't normal. He'd worked with police officers for over a decade. He knew how traffic stops were supposed to go. This felt different. Dangerous, even. "I'm moving my hand slowly to my inside pocket," David announced clearly. "I'm getting my wallet." As his fingers touched his jacket, the officer suddenly stepped back. "Get out of the car." "Get out now!" David froze. "Officer, I'm complying with your request. I'm just getting my identification." "I said get out of the vehicle." The officer's voice rose to a shout. David's mind raced. He was a legal professional. He knew his rights, but he also knew that arguing on the side of the road wouldn't help. Slowly, he opened his car door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. 2 more police cars pulled up behind the first one, their lights painting the dark street in flashes of red and blue. Officers emerged from both vehicles, looking confused about what they'd been called to. One of them, a younger officer with a body camera clearly visible on his chest, approached cautiously. "What's the situation?" the young officer asked. "Suspicious vehicle. Suspicious behavior," Chambers said, though his breathing seemed heavy, almost excited. David spoke up, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Officers, my name is David Chen. I'm an assistant district attorney with the city. I was driving home from work when I was pulled over. I've done nothing wrong, and I've been trying to comply with all instructions." The younger officer's eyebrows went up. "You're Ada Chen? From the DA's office?" "Yes, that's correct. My identification is in my jacket pocket." "May I retrieve it?" Chambers stepped forward aggressively. "He doesn't get to give orders here. I'm the one who stopped him." The other officers exchanged glances. Something wasn't right about this situation, and they could feel it too. The young officer with the body camera seemed to position himself to get a better view of everything happening. "Officer Chambers," David said, using the name he'd read on the badge. "I'm not trying to give orders. I'm simply trying to understand why I was pulled over and to provide my identification as requested." "You were swerving," Chambers said, but even as he said it, one of the other officers looked skeptical. "I wasn't swerving, officer. I'm happy to take any sobriety test you'd like to administer. I haven't been drinking. I was working late at the office." "Step to the back of your vehicle," Chambers ordered. David complied, walking slowly with his hands slightly raised. His legal mind was working through everything that was happening. This stop had no legitimate basis. The officer's behavior was erratic and hostile. And worst of all, David had a sinking feeling about why this was happening. He'd prosecuted enough cases to know prejudice when he saw it. He'd put away officers who'd abused their power. He'd fought against discrimination in the justice system. But knowing about injustice and experiencing it firsthand were two very different things. As he stood at the back of his car, under the glare of multiple flashlights and surrounded by police officers, David realized something terrifying. His education didn't matter right now. His position didn't matter. His years of service to the law didn't matter. Right now, on this dark street, he was completely vulnerable. The young officer stepped closer. "Sir, can you tell me where you're coming from tonight?" "The district attorney's office. I was preparing for a hearing tomorrow. I have my work identification, my bar association card, and my driver's license in my wallet. I'd like to show them to you." Slowly, the young officer said, and David noticed he'd positioned himself between David and Officer Chambers. David carefully reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it and showed his credentials. The young officer examined them with his flashlight, then looked at David's face, then back at the ID. "This is definitely Ada Chen," the young officer called out to his colleagues. "Everything checks out." "I don't care about any of that," Chambers said, and his hand was now resting on his weapon. "Something's not right here." David's blood ran cold. The officer's hand was on his gun. The situation was spiraling out of control, and David knew that his life might actually be in danger. "Officer," David said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm going to be very clear for any cameras that are recording. I am unarmed. I am complying with all instructions. I pose no threat to anyone here. My name is David Chen, and I am an assistant district attorney." He hoped the body cameras were catching everything, because if they weren't, he might not make it home tonight. The night air felt heavy as David stood under the glare of police flashlights. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd spent years in courtrooms staying composed under pressure, but this was different. In court, he had rules protecting him. Out here on this empty street, those rules suddenly felt very far away. Officer Chambers was breathing hard, his hand still resting on his weapon. The other officers seemed confused, looking at each other as if trying to figure out what was actually happening. The younger officer with the body camera had stepped slightly in front of David, creating a buffer between him and Chambers. "Officer Chambers," the young officer said carefully. "His credentials check out. He's Ada Chen. I've seen him at the courthouse." "I don't care who he says he is," Chambers snapped back. His voice had an edge to it that made everyone uncomfortable. Something's not right about this whole thing. David knew he needed to de-escalate the situation. He'd dealt with hostile witnesses before, people who were angry and unpredictable. The key was to stay calm, speak clearly, and not give them any reason to justify their aggression. "Officers," David said, making sure to speak loud enough for all the body cameras to pick up his words. "I understand you're doing your job. I respect law enforcement. I work with police officers every day. I'm not resisting. I'm not being hostile. I just want to resolve this situation peacefully so I can go home to my family." "Where do you live?" Chambers demanded. David gave his address, a nice neighborhood on the other side of town. He saw Chambers' expression change, a sneer forming on his face. "That's a pretty expensive area," Chambers said. "What's a guy like you doing living there?" The words hung in the air. The other officers shifted uncomfortably. Everyone understood what Chambers was really asking, even if he hadn't said it directly. "I live there because I bought a house there," David replied evenly. "With money I earned from my job as a prosecutor." "Prosecutors don't make that much," Chambers challenged. "Some of us have been working for 15 years, David said. "Some of us have spouses with good jobs too, but I don't think where I live is relevant to this traffic stop, officer." The young officer spoke up again. "Officer Chambers, maybe we should just let him go. Everything checks out. We've got his information if we need to follow up on anything." "Nobody asked for your opinion, rookie," Chambers shot back. "I'm the senior officer here. I make the calls." David noticed one of the other officers reaching for his radio. Good. Someone was calling this in. The more people who knew about this situation, the safer he'd be. Chambers took a step closer to David. "Put your hands on the vehicle." "May I ask why?" David kept his voice respectful but firm. "Because I'm telling you to, or are you refusing to comply with a lawful order?" David knew this game. Chambers was trying to create a justification for escalating. If David refused, even if the order was unreasonable, Chambers could claim he was being resistant. But if he complied with every unreasonable demand, where would it end? "I'm not refusing anything, officer. I'm simply asking for clarification about what I'm being detained for. As a citizen and as a legal professional, I have the right to know why I'm being held." "You want to be a lawyer right now?" Chambers' voice rose. "Fine, let's talk about the law. I pulled you over for suspicious driving. I can detain you for a reasonable amount of time to investigate. I can search you if I have reasonable suspicion you're armed or dangerous. So put your hands on the vehicle now." The other officers were watching closely. David could see the calculation happening in their minds. They knew this wasn't right, but Chambers was a veteran officer. Going against him could create problems for their careers. David slowly turned and placed his hands on the trunk of his car. He felt Chambers approach from behind and his entire body tensed. This was one of the most vulnerable positions a person could be in. The pat-down was rough, more aggressive than necessary. Chambers' hands checked his pockets, his waistband, even his ankles. It felt more like a punishment than a professional search. "He's clean," one of the other officers said, as if trying to end this ordeal. But Chambers wasn't done. "What's in your car?" "Legal documents for work. A laptop, my briefcase. Nothing illegal. I think I need to search your vehicle." David's jaw tightened. "On what grounds?" "You've established I'm not impaired, I'm not armed, and my credentials are legitimate. What reasonable suspicion do you have to search my vehicle?" "The fact that you're being defensive about it," Chambers said with a cold smile. "That's suspicious. That's not how the law works, and you know it," David replied. He immediately regretted letting frustration creep into his voice. Chambers moved quickly, grabbing David's arm and pulling it behind his back. "Are you resisting?" "No, I'm not resisting," David said loudly, making sure every camera caught it. "I'm standing still. I'm complying. I'm not resisting." The young officer stepped forward. "Officer Chambers, ease up. He's not fighting you." "Stay out of this," Chambers barked. But the young officer didn't back down. "Sir, I think we need to call a supervisor. This situation needs oversight. I am the supervisor here." Chambers' voice had gone from cold to hot, from controlled to almost frantic. David's mind was racing through possibilities. This officer was unstable. His behavior was irrational. And David was at his mercy on a dark street with witnesses who might be too scared to intervene. He thought about his wife, probably asleep at home, not knowing her husband was in danger. He thought about his 2 kids sleeping in their beds, unaware that their father might not make it home. He thought about all the cases he'd prosecuted where things went wrong, where situations escalated, where someone ended up hurt or worse. "Officer," David said, keeping his voice as steady as he could, "please let go of my arm. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not doing anything. Please just let go." For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The other officers stood watching. Chambers held David's arm twisted behind his back. The lights from the police cars continued their silent rotation. Red and blue, red and blue. Then Chambers released him with a shove. David stumbled forward slightly but caught himself. "Don't move," Chambers ordered, and this time when David looked back, he saw the officer's hand had moved from resting on his weapon to actually gripping it. The night suddenly felt much colder. The other officers saw it too. David watched their body language change, their hands moving to ready positions, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm. "Chambers," one of the older officers said, his voice tense, "what are you doing?" David stood perfectly still. He barely breathed, because he realized something terrifying in that moment. This situation was completely out of control, and there was nothing his education, his position, or his knowledge of the law could do to protect him now. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. David could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He could see Officer Chambers' hand gripping his weapon, knuckles white with tension. The other officers had gone completely still, their faces showing a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. "Chambers, holster your weapon," the older officer said firmly. His voice had changed from questioning to commanding. "There's no threat here." "I'll decide if there's a threat," Chambers replied, but his voice shook slightly. His hand remained on his gun. David's legal training told him to speak clearly to make sure everything was documented. But his survival instinct told him to stay silent, to not make any sudden moves, to not give this unstable officer any excuse. "Officer Chambers," David said slowly, carefully choosing each word. I want to be very clear for the record. I am not reaching for anything. I am not moving toward anyone. I am standing still with my hands visible. I am not a threat to you or anyone else here. Shut up, Chambers shouted. Just shut up with your lawyer talk. The young officer with the body camera had moved to the side, clearly trying to get a clear view of everything happening. His hand was on his own radio, ready to call for help if needed. We need to call this in, the young officer said to his colleagues. We need a supervisor here right now. Nobody's calling anyone, Chambers said. His hand was trembling now, still on his weapon. This is my stop. This is my call. David's mind flashed through scenarios. He'd prosecuted officers who'd made bad decisions in the field. He'd sat in courtrooms and listened to testimony about split-second choices that ended in tragedy. He'd always believed that if people just stayed calm, if they just complied with instructions, these situations could be avoided. Now he understood how wrong that belief had been. He was doing everything right. He was calm. He was compliant. He was respectful, and none of it mattered because the officer in front of him had already decided how this encounter was going to go. I have a wife, David said quietly. I have 2 children. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to go home. Something in Chambers' expression shifted. For just a moment, David thought he saw humanity there, a flicker of recognition that this was wrong. But then it vanished, replaced by something harder, colder. You should have thought about that before you... Chambers didn't finish his sentence. He drew his weapon. Gun! One of the officers shouted. Everything happened at once. David's body reacted before his mind could process it. He shifted to the side, a purely instinctive movement. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the quiet night, echoing off the buildings and pavement. David felt a burning sensation across his shoulder. He stumbled, his hand automatically going to the pain. When he looked at his palm, there was blood. He'd been shot. The realization hit him almost as hard as the bullet had. An officer had just shot him during a traffic stop. He wasn't some dangerous criminal. He wasn't armed. He wasn't threatening anyone. He was a prosecutor, an officer of the court, and he'd just been shot on the side of the road. The other officers erupted into action. The older officer rushed forward and tackled Chambers to the ground. Drop it! Drop the weapon! Chambers seemed stunned by his own actions, his gun falling from his hand as 2 officers pinned him down. The young officer with the body camera rushed to David's side. Sir, stay still. We've got an ambulance coming. Just stay still. David looked down at his shoulder. The bullet had grazed him, tearing through his jacket and shirt, leaving a bloody furrow across his skin. It hurt, but it could have been so much worse. If he hadn't moved, if his instinct hadn't kicked in at exactly the right moment. My name is David Chen, he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the shock. I'm an assistant district attorney. I was pulled over for no legitimate reason. I complied with all lawful orders, and Officer Chambers shot me without justification. I want all of this documented. I want every camera recording secured, and I will be pressing full charges. The young officer nodded, his own hands shaking as he applied pressure to David's wound with a clean cloth from his patrol car. Everything's on camera, sir. Everything. We all saw what happened. David could hear Chambers shouting from where he lay handcuffed on the ground. He was reaching for something. He was going for a weapon. He wasn't reaching for anything. The older officer shouted back. You just shot an unarmed prosecutor. What were you thinking? More police cars were arriving now, their sirens cutting through the night. David could see supervisors getting out of their vehicles, their faces showing shock and anger as they took in the scene. An officer shot a civilian during what should have been a routine traffic stop. This was every department's nightmare. A supervisor rushed over to David. Sir, the ambulance is 2 minutes out. Can you tell me what happened? David took a breath, fighting through the pain and shock. I want to make a statement, and I want it recorded officially. Officer Chambers pulled me over without cause. He escalated a routine stop into an aggressive confrontation. He drew his weapon on an unarmed, compliant citizen, and then he fired that weapon, causing injury. I am a prosecutor. I know how these cases work, and I want everything documented properly because I intend to see justice done. The supervisor's face was pale. Sir, I can assure you that we will investigate this thoroughly. With respect, David said, his lawyer instincts taking over even as paramedics arrived and began treating his wound. I don't want assurances. I want accountability. That officer just tried to kill me, and if I hadn't moved at the last second, he would have succeeded. The paramedics were working on his shoulder now, cleaning the wound, checking for serious damage. One of them looked up at the supervisor. It's a graze wound. He's lucky. Another few inches and we'd be dealing with something much worse. Lucky. David almost laughed at that word. He'd been shot by a police officer during a traffic stop, and he was supposed to feel lucky because the bullet didn't kill him. As the paramedics helped him onto a stretcher, David looked over at Officer Chambers. The man was handcuffed, sitting in the back of a patrol car, his career effectively over the moment he pulled that trigger. Other officers stood around looking shocked, angry, and some of them ashamed. The young officer with the body camera approached the stretcher. "Sir, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry this happened. We tried to stop him," David nodded. "I know you did. And that's going to matter. Your actions tonight, all of you who tried to intervene, that's going to matter when we sort all this out." As the ambulance pulled away, lights flashing, David allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. He'd survived. But things would never be the same. Not for him, not for Officer Chambers, and not for anyone who watched the body camera footage that would soon become public. The shot that Chambers fired didn't just graze David's shoulder. It shattered the thin blue line that protected officers like him. And in the seconds after that trigger was pulled, Chambers' entire career, his reputation, and his freedom began to crumble. David lay in the ambulance, staring at the ceiling, his mind already shifting into prosecutor mode. He knew exactly what was going to happen next, and he was going to make sure that justice was served, not just for himself, but for everyone else who'd suffered at the hands of officers who thought they were above the law. The hospital emergency room was bright and busy even at midnight. David sat on an examination table while a doctor carefully cleaned and bandaged his wound. The bullet had torn through skin and muscle but missed anything vital. He'd need stitches, antibiotics, and pain medication. But he'd survive without any permanent damage, at least not any physical damage. His phone had been ringing constantly since the paramedics had returned it to him. His wife was on her way to the hospital, terrified after getting a call from the police department. His boss, the district attorney himself, had called 3 times. News was spreading fast. "You're very fortunate," the doctor said as she worked. "A few more inches to the right and we'd be dealing with a completely different situation." David nodded, still processing everything. His shoulder hurt, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional shock. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. The look in Chambers' eyes. The sound of the gunshot. The realization that he'd almost died. A nurse poked her head into the examination room. "Sir, there are several people here to see you. The police chief, the district attorney, and internal affairs investigators." "Should I let them in?" "Give me 5 minutes," David said. "And yes, they can come in after that." He needed a moment to collect his thoughts. As a prosecutor, he'd interviewed victims of crimes countless times. He'd sat across from people who'd been hurt, traumatized, violated. He'd always tried to be empathetic, but now he understood in a way he never had before. The shock didn't fade quickly. The fear didn't disappear just because you were safe. His wife burst through the door before the 5 minutes were up, her face streaked with tears. "David, oh my God, David!" He held her with his good arm as she cried against his chest. "I'm okay. I'm all right. I'm here. They said you were shot. They said a police officer shot you." Her voice was broken, disbelieving. "It's true, but I'm okay. It's just a graze wound. I'm going to be fine." She pulled back and looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "What happened? Why would an officer shoot you?" David took a breath. Because he could. Because he thought he could get away with it. But he was wrong. The door opened again and several people entered. The police chief came in first, a man David had met at numerous law enforcement functions. His face was grave, almost gray with stress. Behind him came the district attorney, David's boss, looking equally shaken. 3 internal affairs investigators followed, carrying recording equipment and notebooks. "David," the police chief said, his voice heavy, "I am so deeply sorry about what happened tonight. There are no words to express how wrong this was." David appreciated the sentiment, but he was already in prosecutor mode. Apologies didn't matter. Actions did. "Chief, I need to know what's being done." "Right now." The chief nodded, understanding that David wasn't just a victim. He was a legal professional who knew exactly how these situations should be handled. Officer Chambers has been arrested and is currently in custody. He's been charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and official misconduct. His weapon has been seized as evidence. All body camera footage from the scene has been secured and is being reviewed. We've already pulled his entire personnel file and are conducting a full investigation into his history with the department. His personnel file, David said slowly. Are there previous complaints? The chief's expression answered before his words did. Yes, we're still compiling everything, but preliminary review shows multiple complaints over his 15 years with the department. What kind of complaints? Excessive force, aggressive behavior during traffic stops, use of racial language. The chief looked sick as he said it. These complaints were filed, investigated, and resolved at various levels. Some resulted in written warnings. Some were dismissed as unsubstantiated. David felt anger rising through the pain and shock. How many complaints? 15 documented complaints over his career. 15. David repeated the number. 15 complaints and he was still on the streets. Still had a badge and a gun. The district attorney stepped forward. David, I want you to know that we're treating this with the utmost seriousness. This isn't just an internal matter. We're pursuing criminal charges aggressively. I know you are, David said, because if you don't, I will. I'm the victim here, but I'm also a prosecutor. I know my rights. I know the law, and I'm going to make sure this is handled correctly. One of the internal affairs investigators spoke up. Sir, we need to get your formal statement. I know this is difficult, but the sooner we document everything, the stronger our case will be. David nodded. I want everything recorded. I want it transcribed, and I want copies of all body camera footage from tonight. You'll have access to everything, the chief promised. Full transparency. No cover-ups. No protecting one of our own. What happened tonight was inexcusable. For the next 2 hours, David gave his statement. He walked the investigators through every detail, from the initial traffic stop to the moment he was shot. He described Chambers' behavior, his words, his escalating aggression. He talked about the other officers who tried to intervene, who seemed confused and alarmed by what was happening. The investigators showed him the body camera footage. Watching it was surreal. David saw himself on the screen, calm and respectful, doing everything right. And he saw Chambers, aggressive and hostile from the very beginning. The footage captured everything. The unreasonable commands, the excessive force, and finally the moment Chambers drew and fired his weapon. This is clear-cut, one of the investigators said. I've been doing this for 20 years and I've never seen anything this blatant. He had no justification for any of it. As dawn began to break outside the hospital windows, David's phone rang again. It was a local news reporter. Then another. And another. Word had gotten out. A police officer had shot a prosecutor during a traffic stop, and the media wanted the story. The district attorney's press secretary came in looking frazzled. The story's broken. Every news outlet in the city is calling. They want statements. They want interviews. David looked at his boss. We need to get ahead of this. We need to control the narrative before it controls us. Are you sure you want to make a public statement? The DA asked. You're the victim here. You don't owe anyone anything right now. I'm not just the victim, David said. I'm also the assistant district attorney who's going to prosecute this case. I want people to know that justice will be served. I want them to know that no one is above the law, not even the police officers who are sworn to uphold it. The police chief looked uncomfortable. I understand your anger, David, but please remember, not all officers are like Chambers. Most of our men and women serve with honor and integrity. I know that, David said. I work with good officers every day. But those 15 complaints against Chambers? Someone knew about those. Someone reviewed them. Someone made the decision to keep him on the force despite clear evidence of a pattern of misconduct. That's what I want investigated. Not just Chambers himself, but the system that protected him for 15 years. The room went quiet. Everyone understood what David was really saying. This wasn't just about one bad officer. This was about accountability at every level. As the hospital staff prepared to discharge him, David looked at the people gathered in his room. The police chief, internal affairs investigators, his boss, his colleagues. All of them looked tired, stressed, and worried about what came next. I'm going to recover from this, David said, but I'm not going to forget it. And I'm not going to let it be swept under the rug. What happened to me last night happens to people all the time. The only difference is that I have a platform to fight back. I have resources and knowledge that most victims don't have. And I'm going to use all of it to make sure this never happens to anyone else." His wife squeezed his hand. The investigators nodded. The district attorney looked proud and troubled at the same time. The investigation had begun, but David knew this was just the start of a much longer fight. By the time David left the hospital that morning, the story had exploded across every news platform. The headline was everywhere. Police officer shoots assistant district attorney during traffic stop. The local news had it. National news had picked it up. Social media was on fire with reactions ranging from outrage to disbelief. David's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from colleagues, friends, family members he hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone wanted to know if he was okay. Everyone wanted to know what really happened. And everyone had an opinion about what should happen next. His wife drove him home, both of them quiet during the ride. The painkillers made everything feel slightly fuzzy, but David's mind was sharp enough to understand that his life had changed overnight. He wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. He was a symbol, a victim, a voice for something much bigger than himself. When they pulled into their driveway, there were news vans parked on the street. Reporters with cameras and microphones waited on the sidewalk, held back only by the property line. As soon as they saw the car, they surged forward. "Mr. Chen, can you tell us what happened? How are you feeling? Do you think this was racially motivated? Will you be pressing charges?" David's wife looked at him. "We can go in through the garage. You don't have to talk to them." But David opened his car door. "I need to say something. They're not going to leave until I do." He walked to the edge of his driveway, his arm in a sling, his shoulder bandaged under his torn shirt. The cameras focused on him, catching every detail. He looked tired, hurt but composed. "I'll make a brief statement," he said. "I won't be taking questions right now." The reporters quieted down. Recording devices pointed at him like weapons themselves. "Last night, I was pulled over by a police officer while driving home from work. I complied with every instruction. I identified myself as an assistant district attorney. I remained calm and respectful, and despite doing everything correctly, I was shot by Officer Derek Chambers. The shooting was unprovoked, unjustified, and captured on multiple body cameras." He paused, letting that sink in. "I'm fortunate to be standing here today. The injury could have been much worse. But I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for everyone who has been in a similar situation, but didn't have the resources, the knowledge, or the platform to fight back. What happened to me happens too often in this country, and it needs to stop. I will be cooperating fully with the investigation. I trust that the criminal justice system will hold Officer Chambers accountable for his actions. But I also want to ensure that we examine how an officer with 15 documented complaints was allowed to remain on duty. That's a systemic failure, and it needs to be addressed." He looked directly into the cameras. "To anyone watching who has experienced similar treatment, I want you to know that you're not alone. What happened to you matters. Your story matters. And I will do everything in my power to make sure that accountability becomes the rule, not the exception." With that, he turned and walked into his house, leaving the reporters calling after him with more questions. Inside, his 2 children were waiting, their faces worried. His daughter, 12 years old, ran to him and hugged him carefully, avoiding his injured shoulder. His son 10 stood back, his eyes red from crying. "Dad, are you really okay?" His daughter asked. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I promise." "Why did the police officer hurt you?" his son asked. "Police are supposed to protect people." David sat down on the couch, his children on either side of him. "Most police officers do protect people. They're good people doing a very hard job. But sometimes some officers make very bad choices. And when they do, they need to face consequences just like anyone else." His son nodded slowly, processing this. "Are you going to be the one who makes sure he faces consequences?" "Yes," David said. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." Over the next few days, the story grew bigger. The body camera footage was released to the public, and it spread like wildfire online. People watched in horror as Officer Chambers escalated a simple traffic stop into a shooting. They heard David's calm voice, his respectful words, his clear statements for the record. They saw an unarmed man doing everything right and still getting shot. The public reaction was intense. Protests formed outside the police department headquarters. People carried signs reading "Justice for David Chen" and "No one is above the law" and "End police violence." Community leaders called for immediate reforms. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support, but the reaction wasn't universal. Some people defended Chambers, claiming he must have had a reason to feel threatened. Some accused David of playing the victim for publicity. Some suggested that there must be more to the story than what the cameras showed. David watched it all from his living room, his shoulder healing slowly, his mind working constantly. His colleagues from the district attorney's office called regularly to check on him and to update him on the investigation. The case against Chambers was building rapidly with overwhelming evidence. The district attorney held a press conference. Standing at a podium with American flags behind him, he spoke with conviction. "This office will prosecute Officer Derek Chambers to the fullest extent of the law. The evidence is clear. The facts are indisputable. An officer of the law violated his oath and his duty in the most serious way possible. We will seek justice not just for Assistant District Attorney Chen, but for the principle that no one, regardless of their position, is above the law." The police chief held his own press conference. He looked tired, aged by the scandal. "This incident has shaken our department to its core. We are conducting a comprehensive review of our policies, our training, and our complaint review processes. The fact that Officer Chambers had 15 prior complaints and was still on active duty represents a failure at multiple levels. We are committed to ensuring this never happens again." David watched both press conferences and felt a mix of satisfaction and frustration. The words were right. The promises were right. But he'd worked in the system long enough to know that words and promises weren't always followed by action. His phone rang. It was a lawyer from a major civil rights firm. "Mr. Chen, we'd like to represent you in a civil case against the city and the police department. What happened to you represents a clear violation of your civil rights. We believe you have grounds for a substantial lawsuit." David listened as the lawyer outlined the potential case. Systemic failure to address complaints against Chambers, inadequate training and supervision, a pattern of allowing aggressive behavior to go unchecked. The city could be held liable for millions. "I'll think about it," David said. "Right now I'm focused on the criminal case. But yes, there needs to be accountability beyond just Chambers himself." That evening, David sat at his computer and started writing. He'd been asked by several newspapers to write an opinion piece about his experience. He'd declined initially, needing time to process everything. But now he was ready. He wrote about the fear of that moment when Chambers drew his weapon. He wrote about the realization that his education, his position, his years of public service meant nothing in that moment. He wrote about the other officers who tried to intervene, the good cops who were let down by a system that protected bad ones. But mostly he wrote about what came next. "We cannot simply punish one officer and call it justice," he wrote. "We must examine how that officer was able to continue serving despite clear warning signs. We must look at the structures that protect problematic officers instead of removing them. We must create real accountability, not just public apologies and promises of reform that fade when the news cycle moves on." The piece was published the next day and went viral. People shared it across social media. Other victims of police misconduct reached out to David, thanking him for speaking up, sharing their own stories. Lawyers called offering to help with cases that had been dismissed or ignored. David realized that what had started as a personal trauma was becoming something bigger. A movement, a call for change, and whether he was ready for it or not, he'd become the face of that movement. His colleague from work visited that week, bringing files David had requested. "The whole office is talking about you," she said. "Everyone's proud of what you're doing, but everyone's also worried. You're taking on a lot." "I don't have a choice," David said. "This happened to me for a reason. Maybe not a good reason, but a reason. And if I don't use this moment to push for real change, then what was the point of surviving it?" His colleague nodded. "Just don't forget to take care of yourself too. You've been through trauma. That doesn't just go away because you're fighting for justice." She was right, of course. David still woke up at night sweating, reliving the moment of the gunshot. He still felt anxious when he saw police cars. He still struggled with anger, fear, and a sense of vulnerability he'd never experienced before. But he also felt purpose. And right now that purpose was all that kept him going. 2 weeks after the shooting, investigative journalists started digging into Officer Chambers' past. What they found shocked even David. who thought he'd understood the scope of the problem. The first major story broke in the local newspaper. The headline read, "15 complaints, 0 consequences, the Derek Chambers story." The article detailed every complaint filed against him over his 15-year career. It was worse than anyone had realized. David sat in his home office, his shoulder still healing, reading through the article with growing anger. The complaint started early in Chambers' career. Just 6 months after joining the force, a young man had filed a complaint alleging excessive force during a traffic stop. The complaint was investigated by Chambers' supervisor and deemed unsubstantiated. 2 years later, another complaint. This time from a woman who said Chambers used aggressive language and threatened her during a routine interaction. Again, the complaint was investigated and dismissed. The supervisor's notes said the woman seemed emotional and likely misunderstood the officer's intentions. The pattern continued year after year. Traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily, uses of force that seemed excessive, language that crossed lines. And every single time the complaints were either dismissed or resulted in nothing more than a verbal warning. But the most disturbing detail came buried in the middle of the article. 3 of the 15 complaints had been filed by people of color. All 3 explicitly mentioned what they believed was racial bias. And all 3 had been quickly dismissed by the department's internal review process. David's phone rang. It was a journalist he'd spoken with before. "Mr. Chen, have you seen the story?" "I'm reading it now. We've got more. We've been talking to officers who worked with Chambers. Most won't go on record, but they're talking anonymously. And what they're saying is damning." "Tell me." Multiple officers described Chambers using racial slurs in the locker room, making inappropriate comments about the neighborhoods he patrolled, bragging about being aggressive with people he stopped. One officer said Chambers specifically targeted expensive cars in certain neighborhoods because he, quote, wanted to see if they really belonged there. David closed his eyes. This was exactly what he'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed was still painful. "Why didn't anyone report this?" "Some did. We found 2 internal reports from other officers expressing concerns about Chambers' behavior. Both reports were filed with supervisors. Both went nowhere. One of the officers who filed a report was transferred to a different precinct shortly after. The message was clear: don't make waves. This was the real story. Not just one bad officer, but a system that protected him. Supervisors who ignored warnings. Internal affairs investigations that cleared him despite evidence. A culture that punished whistleblowers instead of wrongdoers. David called the district attorney. "We need to expand this investigation. This isn't just about Chambers anymore. This is about everyone who enabled him." "I agree," the DA said. "We're already looking into it." The supervisors who reviewed those complaints, the internal affairs officers who closed the investigations, the union representatives who defended him. Everyone is under scrutiny now. More stories came out over the following days. A television news team got hold of dashcam footage from several of Chambers' previous traffic stops. The footage showed a pattern of aggressive behavior, especially during stops involving minorities. In one video, Chambers was heard making a comment about a driver not belonging in a particular neighborhood. Another journalist found that Chambers had been moved between precincts 3 times during his career. Each move came shortly after a cluster of complaints. It was a common tactic, David knew. Instead of firing problem officers, departments shuffled them around, hoping the problems would somehow disappear. The police union initially issued a statement defending Chambers, calling for everyone to wait for all the facts before rushing to judgment. But as more information came out, that statement was quietly deleted from their website. The union president held a press conference walking back their initial support. "We support good officers who serve with honor," the union president said, looking uncomfortable. "But we cannot and will not defend actions that violate the public trust. If the allegations against Officer Chambers are proven true, he does not represent the values of our union or our profession." David knew that statement had been carefully crafted by lawyers. It said a lot without saying anything, but it also signaled that Chambers had been cut loose. Even his own union wasn't going to protect him anymore. Anonymous messages started appearing online, posted on forums and social media by people claiming to be police officers. Some defended Chambers, insisting that people who hadn't walked in an officer's shoes couldn't understand the split-second decisions they had to make. But others were surprisingly critical. "I've been a cop for 20 years, one anonymous post read, "and I'm ashamed that Chambers wore the same badge I wear." We all knew he was a problem. We all heard the stories, but nobody wanted to be the one to speak up because that's career suicide in this department. Well, maybe it's time for that to change. David saved that post. It captured exactly what he'd been trying to articulate. The good officers knew who the bad ones were. The system just made it too difficult, too dangerous to do anything about it. His home phone rang one evening. It was someone he hadn't expected, one of the officers who'd been at the scene of his shooting. The young officer with the body camera. "Mr. Chen, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the case file." "It's fine. What can I do for you?" I wanted to apologize. Not for what I did that night, but for what I didn't do before that night. I worked with Chambers for 2 years. I saw things that made me uncomfortable. I heard him say things that weren't okay, and I never reported any of it because I was scared. I was new and he was a veteran, and now you got hurt because people like me stayed quiet. David was quiet for a moment. "What you did that night mattered. You tried to intervene. You positioned yourself to protect me. You made sure everything was on camera. That took courage." "It shouldn't take courage to do the right thing," the young officer said. "That's the problem with this whole system." After they hung up, David sat thinking about that conversation. The young officer was right. It shouldn't take courage to report misconduct. It shouldn't be career suicide to speak up about a dangerous colleague. The system itself was broken. The city council called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. David watched it on television, his daughter sitting next to him doing homework. Council members demanded answers from the police chief. Why hadn't the complaints against Chambers been taken seriously? What policies were in place to identify problem officers? What accountability measures existed? The police chief, looking exhausted, admitted that the system had failed. "We relied too heavily on individual supervisors to handle complaints," he said. "We didn't have adequate oversight. We didn't track patterns across an officer's entire career. We didn't take complaints seriously enough, especially when they came from communities that historically had difficult relationships with law enforcement." One council member asked the question that was on everyone's mind. How many other officers are out there right now with similar complaint histories? The chief hesitated. "We're reviewing every officer's file. Preliminary data suggests approximately 30 officers have 5 or more complaints in their files. We're investigating each case individually." 30 officers. David felt sick. 30 potential time bombs walking around with badges and guns waiting to hurt someone else. His phone buzzed with a text from a colleague. "The news just reported that 2 more people have come forward with allegations against Chambers from years ago. They never filed official complaints because they didn't think anyone would believe them. But now they're talking." This was how it always went, David knew. One person speaking up gave others the courage to do the same. His case had opened a floodgate of stories that had been suppressed for years. A national civil rights organization announced they were sending a team to investigate the city's police department. They would conduct interviews, review policies, and issue recommendations for reform. The mayor, facing intense public pressure, agreed to cooperate fully. David's civil rights lawyer called with an update on the potential lawsuit. "We've identified at least 8 incidents where complaints against Chambers were improperly dismissed or minimized. We have documentation showing supervisors were aware of his problematic behavior, and we have testimony from officers willing to say that the department had a pattern of protecting problem officers. This case is getting stronger every day." But David wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about change. "If we file a lawsuit, I want part of the settlement to require specific reforms. Training programs, accountability measures, an independent review board. I don't just want a payout. I want to make sure this can't happen again." "That's unusual," the lawyer said. "Most plaintiffs just want compensation." "I'm not most plaintiffs," David replied. "And this isn't just about me." That night, David had trouble sleeping. The pain medication helped with his shoulder, but it couldn't touch the mental anguish. He kept thinking about all the complaints that had been ignored. 6 months after the shooting, the trial of Derek Chambers began. The courthouse was packed with reporters, activists, police officers, and citizens who wanted to witness justice in action. Security was heightened. Emotions ran high on both sides. David sat in the gallery, not at the prosecutor's table. The district attorney had assigned the case to another senior prosecutor to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest. But David had been consulted at every step. This was his case as much as it was anyone's. Chambers walked into the courtroom in a suit, not a uniform. He'd been fired from the police department 2 months earlier, his termination coming after the internal investigation concluded. He looked smaller somehow, without the badge and gun that had given him authority for 15 years. The jury had been carefully selected. 12 citizens who would hear the evidence and decide Chambers' fate. David watched them file in, wondering what they were thinking, what they already believed about this case that had dominated the news for half a year. The prosecutor's opening statement was clear and direct. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a police officer who violated every oath he took. Officer Derek Chambers was given a badge, a gun, and the public's trust. He was supposed to protect and serve. Instead, he pulled over an innocent man, escalated a routine traffic stop through his own aggression, and then shot that unarmed man without justification. The evidence will show that this was not a split-second decision made in fear. This was the culmination of a career marked by aggression, prejudice, and a belief that he was above the law. Chambers' defense attorney gave his opening statement next. He tried to paint a picture of a difficult job, of split-second decisions, of an officer who genuinely believed he was in danger. Officer Chambers served this city for 15 years. He faced dangerous situations that most of us can't imagine. On that night, he made a decision that he believed was necessary to protect himself. Was it the right decision? That's what we're here to determine. But before you judge him, consider the context in which police officers work every day. David listened and felt his jaw tighten. The context. The defense was going to try to justify everything with context, as if being a police officer gave you the right to shoot unarmed people. The first week of the trial focused on the shooting itself. The prosecutor called the officers who had been at the scene. One by one, they testified about what they witnessed. The young officer with the body camera described Chambers' escalating aggression. At what point did you become concerned? The prosecutor asked. When he drew his weapon, the young officer said. There was no reason for it. Mr. Chen was complying with every instruction. He was calm. He wasn't threatening anyone, and Officer Chambers drew his gun anyway. What did you do? I made sure my body camera had a clear view of everything. I positioned myself so I could intervene if necessary, and I was ready to call for additional backup if the situation escalated further. The defense attorney cross-examined. But you didn't actually intervene, did you? You didn't tell Officer Chambers to holster his weapon? He was the senior officer on scene. I tried to de-escalate verbally, but he wasn't listening to anyone. So you let it happen? The young officer looked pained. I was trying to handle a dangerous situation without making it worse. In hindsight, I wish I'd done more. But at that moment, I was trying to keep everyone safe. David felt sympathy for the young officer. He'd been put in an impossible position, caught between doing right and respecting the chain of command. The older officer who'd tackled Chambers after the shooting testified next. His testimony was even more damaging to the defense. In your 25 years as a police officer, how many times have you seen an officer draw a weapon on someone who posed no threat? Before that night? Never. We're trained extensively on when it's appropriate to draw our weapons. Mr. Chen presented no threat whatsoever. He was compliant, respectful, and clearly not dangerous. What went through your mind when Officer Chambers fired his weapon? Honestly, I thought, his career is over and someone might die. I tackled him immediately because I was afraid he might fire again. The body camera footage was played in court. The jury watched in silence as the entire encounter unfolded on screens. David watched their faces. Some looked horrified. Some looked angry. All of them seemed affected by what they saw. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. David was called to testify. He walked to the witness stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. He sat down and looked at the jury, then at Chambers, then at the prosecutor. The prosecutor led him through his testimony gently but thoroughly. David described his career as a prosecutor, his work with law enforcement, his respect for good officers. Then he described the night of the shooting minute by minute. When Officer Chambers pulled you over, what was your first thought? I wondered what I'd done wrong. Maybe my taillight was out. Maybe I'd been going a little over the speed limit without realizing it. I wasn't worried. I'd done traffic stops before. I knew how they worked. At what point did your concern level change? When Officer Chambers' first words were aggressive, there was no good evening or professional courtesy, just immediate hostility. That's when I knew something was different. What did you do? I tried to de-escalate. I was polite. I announced every movement I made. I identified myself as a prosecutor. I did everything I'd advise anyone else to do in that situation. And did it work? No, if anything, it seemed to make him angrier. It was like he'd already decided how this was going to go, and nothing I did mattered. David described the moment Chambers drew his weapon. His voice remained steady, but his hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. I was looking at a gun pointed at me, and I knew in that moment that I might die, not because I'd done anything wrong, not because I was a threat, but because the man holding that gun had decided I was, and there was nothing I could do about it. What were you thinking? I was thinking about my wife and kids. I was thinking that they'd wake up tomorrow and I'd be gone. I was thinking that I'd spent 15 years prosecuting criminals, fighting for justice, and I was going to be killed by someone who was supposed to be on the same side. The courtroom was completely silent. Tell the jury what happened when Officer Chambers fired his weapon. I saw his finger move on the trigger. My body reacted before my brain processed it. I moved to the side just a few inches. The bullet grazed my shoulder instead of hitting my chest. If I hadn't moved at that exact moment, I wouldn't be here testifying today. The prosecutor let that statement hang in the air before continuing. After you were shot, you made a very specific statement. Can you tell the jury what you said? I said that I wanted everything documented. I wanted every camera secured. I wanted a formal statement on record, because I knew that if I survived, I was going to make sure Officer Chambers was held accountable, not just for what he did to me, but for what he represented, a system that protects bad officers instead of removing them. The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive. He tried to suggest that David had been uncooperative, that he'd made Chambers feel threatened, that his position as a prosecutor had made him arrogant. Isn't it true that you refused to comply with Officer Chambers' initial instructions? That's not true. I complied with every lawful instruction. You questioned him, didn't you? You asked why you'd been pulled over? Citizens have the right to ask that question. It's not resistance to politely inquire about the reason for a stop. You immediately told him you were a prosecutor. Weren't you trying to intimidate him? I identified my profession the same way anyone would. If I were a doctor or a teacher or a construction worker, I might have mentioned that too. It was a simple statement of fact, not intimidation. The defense attorney tried various angles, but David remained calm and consistent. He'd spent years in courtrooms. He knew how to handle cross-examination. When David stepped down from the witness stand, he felt emotionally exhausted but also relieved. He'd told his story. The jury had heard the truth. The trial continued with expert witnesses. A police training expert testified that Chambers violated every protocol in the book. A psychologist discussed implicit bias and how it affects decision-making. A use of force expert explained in detail why the shooting was unjustified. The defense called their own experts, but their testimony felt weak compared to the overwhelming evidence against Chambers. They talked about stress, about difficult decisions, about the dangers police officers face, but none of it explained why Chambers shot an unarmed, compliant man. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. The prosecutor stood before the jury and spoke with passion. Officer Derek Chambers had a choice that night. He could have treated David Chen with professionalism and respect. He could have issued a warning or a ticket and sent him on his way. Instead, he chose aggression. He chose escalation, and ultimately, he chose violence. That wasn't the split-second decision of a scared officer. That was the culmination of 15 years of getting away with behavior that should have ended his career long before that night. The defense attorney made his closing argument, but even he seemed to lack conviction. The evidence was simply too strong. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, the sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks after the verdict. The courtroom was packed again, but the atmosphere was different. There was a sense of finality in the air, a feeling that this long chapter was finally coming to a close. David sat in the front row with his wife. His shoulder had healed completely by now, though he still felt phantom pain sometimes, especially when he was stressed. The physical wound had closed, but the emotional one was still there. Probably always would be. The judge entered and everyone stood. Judge Robertson was known for being fair but firm. She'd presided over the entire trial with patience and careful attention to the law. Now she would decide Derek Chambers' fate. The prosecutor stood first. Your Honor, the state recommends the maximum sentence allowable under law. This was not an accident. This was not a mistake made in the heat of the moment. This was a calculated act of violence by an officer who believed he was above the law. The defendant's 15-year history of complaints shows a pattern of behavior that the system failed to address. That failure nearly cost David Chen his life. Chambers' defense attorney made his plea for leniency. He talked about his client's years of service, his family, his remorse, but the words rang hollow after everything that had been revealed during the trial. Then the judge asked if David wanted to make a victim impact statement. David stood and walked to the podium. He'd written and rewritten this statement a dozen times. He needed to get it right. Your Honor, he began. When Officer Chambers shot me, he didn't just injure my shoulder. He damaged my sense of security, my trust in the system I'd spent 15 years serving, and my belief that doing everything right would keep me safe. I'm a prosecutor. I know the law. I followed every rule. And I still got shot. David paused, looking at Chambers, who sat with his head down, avoiding eye contact. But I'm not here just to talk about what happened to me. I'm here to talk about what didn't happen for 15 years before that night. 15 complaints. 15 opportunities to remove a dangerous officer from the streets. 15 times the system failed. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I survived. I had resources, education, and a platform to fight back. How many others didn't? How many others suffered at this man's hands and had no voice, no power, no way to make it right? The courtroom was silent. David continued, I don't want revenge, Your Honor. I want accountability. I want Officer Chambers to face the consequences of his actions so that other officers understand that the badge doesn't put them above the law. I want the sentence to send a message that violence, prejudice, and abuse of power will not be tolerated, no matter how long you've worn the uniform. David returned to his seat. His wife squeezed his hand. Judge Robertson looked at Chambers. Mr. Chambers, do you have anything to say before I impose sentence? Chambers stood slowly. He looked older than he had at the start of the trial, more tired. Your Honor, I never meant for things to go the way they did. I was doing my job. I made decisions that I thought were right at the time. I'm sorry that Mr. Chen was hurt. I'm sorry for everything. The apology felt inadequate, rehearsed. David noticed the judge's expression didn't change. Judge Robertson opened her sentencing document. Mr. Chambers, you were entrusted with tremendous power and responsibility. You were given a badge and a gun and the authority to enforce the law. Instead, you used that power to intimidate, harass, and ultimately harm an innocent citizen. The evidence presented at trial showed a pattern of misconduct spanning your entire career. This was not an isolated incident. This was who you chose to be as an officer. She paused, letting her words sink in. The jury found you guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and official misconduct. These are serious crimes made more serious by the fact that you committed them while wearing a badge. The law provides for a maximum sentence of 10 years on the assault charge and 3 years on the misconduct charge. David held his breath. I am sentencing you to 8 years in state prison on the assault charge, and 2 years on the misconduct charge to run consecutively. That's 10 years total. Additionally, you will permanently lose your law enforcement certification and your police pension. When you're released, you will be on supervised probation for 5 years and will be prohibited from working in any law enforcement capacity ever again. The gavel came down. Chambers' attorney looked defeated. Chambers himself showed little reaction, as if he'd already accepted his fate. 10 years. David felt a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't the maximum, but it was substantial. More importantly, Chambers would never wear a badge again. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed David. He made a brief statement. Today, justice was served. But this case was never just about one officer. It was about a system that protected him for 15 years despite clear warning signs. I'm grateful for the verdict and the sentence, but the work isn't done. We need real reform to ensure this never happens again. The next day, the police chief announced a series of major reforms. The department was implementing a new early warning system to track officer complaints and identify patterns. They were creating an independent civilian review board with real power to investigate misconduct. They were mandating additional training on de-escalation and implicit bias, and they were reviewing the files of every officer with multiple complaints. David was asked to serve on the new civilian review board. He accepted immediately. This was the work that mattered now. 3 months after the sentencing, David received a call from a national police reform organization. They wanted him to speak at their annual conference, to share his story and his insights about how to create accountability in law enforcement. He agreed, and soon found himself traveling to different cities, talking to police chiefs, community leaders, and activists about reform. He shared his experience not as a victim, but as someone who understood both sides, the challenges law enforcement faced and the need for accountability when officers crossed lines. His story became part of a larger conversation about police reform that was happening across the country. Other victims reached out to him, asking for advice, seeking support. He connected them with lawyers, helped them navigate the legal system, advocated for their cases. David's civil lawsuit against the city was settled for $2 million. But more importantly, the settlement included mandatory reforms, improved training, better complaint investigation procedures, and a commitment to transparency and disciplinary actions. David donated half the settlement to organizations working on police reform and criminal justice advocacy. At the district attorney's office, David was promoted to chief of the Special Prosecutions Division. He now oversaw cases involving public corruption, police misconduct, and civil rights violations. He'd found his calling in this work, using his position to ensure accountability at every level. 1 year after the shooting, David was invited to speak at a police academy graduation. Standing before 150 new officers, he shared his story. "I don't tell you this story to make you fear the job you're about to do," he said. "I tell you this story because you represent the future of law enforcement. You can choose to be different than Officer Chambers. You can choose to speak up when you see misconduct. You can choose to treat every person you encounter with dignity and respect, and you can choose to hold yourselves and your colleagues to the highest standards." He saw young faces looking back at him, some understanding the weight of what he was saying, others still idealistic about the badge they were about to receive. The badge you'll receive today is a symbol of public trust. It's an honor and a responsibility. What you do with it will define not just your career, but the community's relationship with law enforcement for years to come. Be the officers we need. Be the officers we deserve. And never ever believe that the badge puts you above the law you've sworn to uphold. The applause was genuine. After the ceremony, several new officers approached him, thanking him for his words, promising to remember them. David went home that evening and sat with his family at dinner. His daughter was now in high school, his son in middle school. They'd both been changed by what happened to their father. They asked more questions now, pushed back on assumptions, understood that authority didn't always mean righteousness. "Dad," his son asked during dinner, "do you think things are really changing? Like because of what happened to you?" David thought about it carefully. "I think some things are changing. We've got new policies, new training, more accountability measures. But real change takes time. It takes constant effort. It takes people refusing to look away when they see something wrong." His daughter chimed in. "You're one of those people, Dad. You didn't look away." David smiled. "I didn't have much choice. But yeah, I guess I'm trying to make something positive come from something terrible." His wife reached across the table and took his hand. They'd been through a lot together this past year. Therapy sessions to deal with his trauma, late nights when he couldn't sleep, moments of anger and fear and frustration, but they'd gotten through it together. The young officer who'd been at the scene that night, the one with the body camera, reached out to David several months later. They met for coffee, an unusual friendship between a prosecutor and a patrol officer, but one built on shared experience.